Hi everybody, my name is Daniel Wilson. I'm a developer and a technical writer. I'm based here in Munich and I do a lot of work for Wirecard here in Munich. And I'm here today to show you the Wirecard ePOS SDK. And over the next 30 minutes, we're going to use this SDK to create both an iOS and an Android application to show you how simple it is to hook into the underlying code in the SDK to create a very powerful payment acceptance app. So here's the app that we're going to create over the next 30 minutes, and you can see it's got just a simple calculator for entering payment information, as well as a cash button and a card button. And that's what we're going to do today, set up a simple cash payment using the SDK, and then we're going to show you how you would set up a card transaction. Now, just so you know, for our Chinese customers out there, we also support WeChat Pay and Alipay, but you can read about that all online. For now, today, we'll keep it really simple because we just want to show you the power of the SDK. Let's dive right in and start creating our apps, and your starting point for doing that is the Wirecard ePOS SDK documentation, which I actually wrote with the help of the developers. So I'll give you a quick tour. In the start section, we have introductory information, an overview of the ePOS architecture, the SDK architecture, and we'll come back to that in about a minute. Next, we have how to set up the SDK on Android. You can do that with Gradle or manually. Again, we'll come back to that. Set up on iOS using CocoaPods, which is how we're going to do it today. And also initializing the SDK. That's very important because obviously when you're developing a payment acceptance app, you need a backend to process the transactions. So Wirecard provides you a public test environment that you can connect to, and within your first few minutes of developing, you can be testing your app on a real backend. It's a test system, but it shows you what a transaction would look like. Next, we have the integrate section, and this is where we did most of our work. It really walks you through in detail how to use the 9 different components that make up the SDK. Starting with the sales manager, that's what we're going to cover today. So on the sales manager side, we have how to do a cash transaction, how to do a card transaction, and that's what we're going to cover in this video tutorial. We also have the cash manager, the inventory manager. You can use this SDK to set up a complete catalog of all your products. We won't cover that today, but this is a public website, so you can look that up. Next, we have the references section, and for developers, you'll find this very useful because it's probably way more detail than you need right now, but as you get into the code and start plowing through it, you'll find this very useful because all the packages, all the various classes, the methods, the object hierarchies, it's all documented here, and it's all generated straight out of the code, so it's completely up to date. Over on the iOS side, we have the exact same thing. All the various classes, the class hierarchy, here's an example, and the iOS documentation also has class hierarchy diagrams. So once again, way more detail than you need right now. Let's keep it really simple, and let's look now at the architecture. So I want to begin by going through the architecture just to get you oriented a little bit, because it can be a little bit confusing when you first start developing with the SDK. So over here on the left, we have the Wirecard ePOS SDK. With it, you can create iOS and Android apps. Now, you folks out there, the developers, we refer to you as the partners because you, the partner, is working with the merchant to create a mobile point of sale system. So on your tablets and your mobile devices, ultimately what we're going to end up with is an app that the staff from the restaurant or the bar or the store can use to take payments from the consumer or returns and refunds and so forth. We're not going to cover returns and all the fancy stuff today. We're going to keep it strictly to cash and credit purchases. One other quick point, that behind we've got a backend, this is what we call the switch backend, and we'll get to that in a minute. There's what we call the public test environment that allows you to set up and do development and testing on a temporary environment. And we're going to initialize the SDK and get to that in a minute. One other point is you can connect an ERP system to the switch backend. If you're using SAP by design and you've got your product catalog, you can integrate that. Again, way more detail than we want to get into today. We're going to focus on cash and credit transactions. So that's kind of the big picture of the architecture. So now, what I want to do is actually look inside the ePOS SDK and show you the architecture inside that box. So here's the SDK architecture. We've got the sales manager up here, cash manager, inventory manager. This is where a lot of the power of the SDK lies. The inventory manager lets you do your product catalog. Cash manager lets you do pay-ins, payouts, shift work, Z reports. We're not going to cover that today. I just wanted to point out that it's there. We're going to focus on the sales manager. But I also want to point out that there's 4 different types of hardware that you can connect up to the SDK. You can connect terminals or card readers. You can connect a cash drawer or a printer or a scanner. And these 4 boxes here all relate to setting up hardware. Basically, if you plug a card reader into this app, then the terminal manager sees that it's there. And when we do a credit transaction, I'll show you exactly how that works. Let's now set up the environments in which we want to do our development for both Android and iOS. Now, as you probably know, you can download the development Xcode from the App Store. You get Android Studio Pro from Google, so I won't cover that. Once you have those environments set up and ready to go, you can jump into the setup section of the documentation. And under Android, we have a manual setup and we have an automated setup with Gradle. So to set it up on Gradle, you really just need to add these 2 lines. We provide the SDK as a Maven repository, so by adding the JITpack and the Wirecard ePOS, you're good to go. You have to specify that it's a multi-dex application and that you're using Java, obviously. All the coding we're going to do today in Android is Java, so you need those lines. And these lines down here at the bottom of your project Gradle is for the SDK, but also for the Datex printer and the Spire terminal. Now, which hardware you want to use for the app, you'll need to discuss with your customer, the merchant, but we've set up a basic printer and a basic terminal here, just so we can see how that works. Now, over on the iOS side, again, we have a manual setup and an automated setup with CocoaPods, but as you iOS developers will know, CocoaPods makes life a lot easier. You add these lines that you see here to your CocoaPod file and do a pod install, and that's it. All the frameworks, all the various pods that you need to start your development are all set up in Xcode. So let me open Xcode now, and it's called the Clear application, the one that I showed you before and we're going to develop today. Let's start by creating the Xcode app using Swift. So if you're an Android developer, you may want to skip forward 10 minutes in the video, at which point we cover Android Studio Pro and coding in Java. But right now I want to look at Xcode, and here we have on my screen everything that you get after you do the pod install. So what I want to show you first of all is down the bottom here, here's all the pods that you get by doing that pod install. And the most important ones that you need to be aware of are under WD ePOS, and specifically the core frameworks are located here. Remember, we talked about the Datex printer. That's one of the printers that you can hook up. That's stored here, and the Socket Inspire Postmate is a terminal that you can use. We'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about credit cards, but for now we're going to really focus on doing a cash transaction. So let me open up the files and just give you a real quick tour. Up top we have the app Swift delegate. Nothing too exciting going on here, pretty standard. Where most of the code is stored for the sample app that I showed you earlier is in the payment VC.swift file. So I'll open it up here. And VC stands for view controller. This is basically controlling what's going on in your view. And we'll come back to that one in a minute. What I wanted to show you first is the detail VC.swift file. So down the bottom of the detail VC.swift file, earlier I talked about the public test environment, and obviously with a payment app, you need to process your transaction in the back end. So the difficulty for any developer is having a good environment that's realistic, and Wirecard provides what we call the public test environment. So down here with this line here, what we're doing is we're really just initializing the SDK. So we're setting up a shared instance with this username and this password. And when you begin as a partner developer with Wirecard, you'll be provided with a username and a password for your own public test environment. So that's how you initialize the SDK. And let me jump back over quickly to the documentation because you're probably not going to remember this. It's a lot of detail. So if you look in the setup section of the public website documentation that we have SDK initialization here. So this is a good example of how you really use the SDK. We kind of walk you through with the documentation, explain what the SDK does, how to initialize it. As you can see here, really important point, the highest level class on iOS is called WD ePOS. WD, by the way, stands for Wirecard. That one threw me at first, should be obvious, but WD is Wirecard. And then the highest level class in Android is ePOS SDK. So the designs are very similar, but you have some variations from platform to platform. Now for every set of functionality in the SDK, we have the sample code that you can use. And this is the essence of how you use the SDK. Our developers, who are fantastic, have put together all of the code for you, and you can see it here on the iOS platform. We just click on the Apple icon and that gives us iOS. So we've got SDK code and we've got the Swift code, and we've got really great code comments that walk you through exactly how to use this code. Our guys document the code better than any developers I've ever seen. So you can see there's very detailed instructions to help you out with the code. And all of this code is stored on Gist or Gist, however you pronounce it. It's a great little utility that provides sample code that you can use as a starting point in your apps. So if I actually click on it, it takes me out to Gist. So we kind of version and provide sample code to you through Gist over here. What I usually do when I'm developing is I do view raw, and that gives you the code, and then you can just grab it and copy it over to your own app. Now our app is already set up a little bit, so I'll jump back to our app and you can see that's exactly the code that I was gonna copy in. So that's one line of code, all you really need to initialize your SDK in iOS. Let's jump back to the Swift code in the documentation. And I just wanted to point out there is the user completion setup code here. And if we go back over to our app, you can see up here we're doing some user authentication. I don't want to get into a lot of detail about user authentication because it's a very simple app that we've created here, and we're just logging on a default user. The key point is we support multiple users, so if you want to have one iPad or tablet for multiple staff in your store, it's easy to set that up, but we're not going to cover that right now. What I wanted to do now is get over to the storyboard for the payment scene, because this is the app that I showed you at the beginning of the video, and this is the app that we're creating. So we've got the simple calculator here and the cash and the card button, just like you saw on the iPhone. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and run it. After a few seconds, the app shows up in the simulator. So if I click on payment, you can see the calculator just like you saw on my own iPhone 7. I'm running it in an iPhone 7 simulator here. If I enter €100 and then click on cash, it actually processes that transaction. So you can see we provide a receipt with a barcode down the bottom, and we've put through an entire cash transaction. So let's look at the code underlying that that actually handles that cash transaction. Here again, we want to go into detail, and let's actually, just to draw the link between the app and the code. So to start looking at the code that handles the user interface, we go into the paymentvc.swift, and you can see here, again, I'm not going to cover how to set up an interface using Xcode. Bottom line is that when somebody taps a number, we're grabbing that. We're also grabbing the amount here, and we're figuring out, is it a card or is it a cash payment? So that a little bit further down below, see this function here, pay is card? That's where we're actually going to process the cash transaction. And we're passing in is card just to let the code below know if we're dealing with a card or a credit transaction. So at this point though, let me jump back to the documentation. So we're in the integrate section now, and this is the sales manager component. And I'll go into sales request cache because I wanted to show you the design. There's lots of information in here, but here's the key point. Here's what the iOS object model looks like. Everything really starts with a sale request, and a sale request has a type, and typically that type is purchase. It can also be a refund and a couple of other types, but really everything starts with a purchase transaction, so we'll focus on that. And really all you're doing is adding a sale item and adding a cash payment to your sale request, and then you're passing it to an object called payment config. So you can read more about it here in the documentation, but I just want to jump down here and show you the code. Again, our iOS code is here, our Android code is here, which we'll cover later on. But in terms of the iOS code, we want to look at Swift, and here again, the code shows you exactly how you need to set up this functionality. So you can see we've got the sales request object, then we're adding a sale item to the object, and then we're saying it's a purchase, as you can see here in the code, and then we're doing an add cash. So really, the only fundamental difference between doing a cash payment and a card payment is this line here. It's a bit more complicated than that, but essentially a lot of the code is the same. So as I mentioned, as a developer, what you'll want to do is copy the code from here into your app, but to save some time, I've already done that. So here's the same code in the pay function. So if we go down, here's the key method or the key object, sale request. Everything is about the sale request because it's all about making sales with a payment acceptance app. What we're doing is we're passing a unique ID here. Then we're kind of setting up the sale with where's your location, do you include or exclude taxes here, what's the currency. You can also attach a note to the transaction, which a lot of merchants will want to do, and also gratuity. We have strong support for service industries, restaurants, bars, where there's gratuity. So if there's tax on that gratuity, you set that there. So that's all the general stuff for your transaction. But next, we set up the sale item. And obviously you can have multiple items. If your customer buys 20 things from you, you can set up multiple items. But for simplicity in our demo app, we just did one item at a time. So all we're really doing here is we're passing the amount. Remember I got the amount on the on tap? So they say I want to spend 100 euros cash. That 100 is passed in this variable here. We just default to a quantity of 1. We set the tax rate. We put a general description. Again, nothing too fancy because it's a demo app. And if you want to have an external product ID, you can also define that here. But just like the SDK code in GIST, we're setting this to a purchase. Again, code comments are great. They show you exactly what the code's all about. You can do a return, an authorize, or a pre-authorize here as well. But we'll keep it simple with a purchase. You can also set a cash register. You may have more than one cash registers in your shop, so you can set that here, but we don't use that for now. And then the next object is the payment configuration object. That's really getting ready to send the whole transaction to the back end. So at this point, with this if statement and the else's down here, we're really just saying, is this a card? Because we want to deal with a card transaction a little bit different than we deal with a cash transaction. So here's what we're doing with our cash transaction. We're just saying on the sales request, add the cash payment, and then we're saying add the sale request to payment configuration.sale. So that payment configuration is what we're going to throw over to the back end to process that 100 euro transaction. And here's, typically with Swift code, you want to go down and look at the last line because that's where everything happens. So what we're doing here is a WD ePOS, that's our SDK object. Sale Manager is the big component that handles all the sales. And then we're running our pay function, which we just defined above, with the payment configuration. And then we send it all to the back end to be processed. And that's really what gives you what I just showed you in the simulator. I'll jump back to it. Let me do it again. That's what gives you this. And I don't know if you noticed this before, but we actually sort of, just for developers, we're dumping out the basic information down here. So a lot of those variables, you can keep track of them in the terminal or dump them onto the screen we've done here if you want to do debugging and so forth for a cash transaction. So that's really the start of our app with a basic cash transaction. Let me jump out to the documentation again and do a quick review because I hit you with a lot of information there. If we go back to the start section, let's revisit the architecture. So that cash transaction that we just put through is all handled by the sales manager. Now remember I said up front, we've got all these components like inventory manager, terminal manager, cash drawer manager. A lot of these handle hardware. So what we're gonna look at now as we start to put through a credit card transaction, or a card transaction that is terminal manager, because obviously you need a terminal, a card reader set up in order to do a credit card transaction. So that's where we want to use terminal manager. And once again, in the integrate section of the documentation, we've got a whole section that covers how to use terminal manager. But basically, if you plug in your device to the app that you create, we'll automatically discover that device so you can then put through credit card transactions on it. So let me show you some of the code behind it. We want to jump back now to Sales Manager, and we're looking at sales request for a card. Remember, with a cash transaction, everything starts with the sales request object. For a card transaction, it's exactly the same. We're using the sale request, so a lot of the code is the same, but let's take a quick look. So we have the sale request object here, we have the purchase type, and then we're gonna say add a card payment. Remember in the earlier code it was add a cash payment. Now we're gonna add in a terminal, and that terminal gets discovered by the discover devices method. There's Android, we'll look at that later. Let's jump down to the sample code and go into Swift. So you see, this should look pretty familiar at this point. We've got a sale request object, we've got a sale item, we're passing the amount and the quantity into it. The only thing different is this line here. So down here we have the sale request object, and the add card payment method is doing the real grunt work here for you. This is almost the same as add cash payment, but we're actually passing in a terminal. So that terminal that we discovered early on is being passed into this transaction. And that's really the only fundamental difference between your card code and your cash code. So let me jump back into Xcode, and yeah, I'll show it to you here. So remember, this is the block that I showed you earlier, the if statement, if card is true. So this is where we handle a card. And we've got really almost exactly the same code. We just say sale request, we're gonna add a card payment here with the amount that we got from the user interface and the terminal that we've discovered. We're gonna put that into the payment configuration, and then boom, the pay method is actually gonna send it to the back end and your card transaction is processed. Now, obviously with a card, it gets a lot more complicated than that. And what we provide for you, if we go up here in the code, is all the different states that you need to deal with for a card transaction. So here is the WD state update. The SDK is going to constantly feed you messages from the terminal. So you can see the messages are here. Follow instructions on the terminal, insert or swipe the card. So for each of these are really code stubs. So it's setting up the starting point for an app. Every app will want to handle this in a slightly different way. Let me look for a couple more examples. Please remove the card's been removed, every step of the process, PIN entered, hand the terminal to the customer. All of that, there's stubs in the code for you to set up. And that's about it. I think I want to leave it at that in terms of the iOS Swift code and kind of jump out to the documentation again. Okay, so that's how to do a card transaction and a cash transaction with the Swift code in the app. There's a lot more information in here if you want to set up alternative payment methods. The payment chapter is really useful because that shows you a full set of complete code. So if you're creating your own app, you can just copy and paste from here. And there's a lot more here too. Sales returns, reversals, how to set up sales statistics. There's a lot of power in there. There's also cash manager. So opening and closing shifts, pay-ins, payouts, inventory manager. You can set up a complete product catalog using the SDK. That's covered here. And then all the various hardware devices. Finally, there's the customer manager. So if you want to get customer information from your backend, you can use the customer manager to do that. And if you want to set up various users, if you got 10 different waiters and waitresses at your restaurant and you want them to use the same 1 or 2 iPads, then you can use our user manager to set up logins, password changes, and confirmations. But I think in terms of Xcode, that pretty much covers it, because we've got, if we look over here, our basic cash and card transaction set up and working in our simple app here. Now let's jump over to the Android platform and do some Java programming. So if you remember the setup at Android, you can actually set it up with Gradle files. So let's go in. I've already set this up for us and take a look at what we get. So here you see the app that we created and all the code, the manifest XML file, pretty standard stuff. We're creating a Wirecard ePOS application. Where it gets a little more interesting is, remember the code that I showed you before? Here it's actually in the application. So these lines here basically call in the SDK code. And that's the project Gradle. If we look in the module Gradle file, you can see we've got a bunch of configuration here, Java, and down here we've got the ePOS SDK and our hardware setup, the DATEX printer, the Spire terminal. So if I jump back, because it was a while ago that we covered it, if you need to put this code into your Gradle files, you can just grab it here from the gist. All right, let me jump back to Android Studio and let's look at some of the Java code. So most of the code you want is in the de.wirecard.epos demo, DE standing for Deutschland, which is Germany. So the starting point is the ePOS SDK application that extends the multi-dex application. And the reason for that is there's 66,000 or more methods, and when you have that many methods, you need to extend multi-dex. You can look that up online, more information, but you need to extend multi-dex. Remember I told you earlier that the main object, the highest level object, is the ePOS SDK object. Here we're going to go ahead and initialize that object. So just like we did over on the Android Xcode side, you want to pass in a username and a password. You can talk to your Wirecard representative when you sign up as a partner with us. They'll give you this information. So here's our ePOS SDK object. So what we're doing here, a little bit different from Swift code, but we're using a builder to actually build the SDK object. And what we're doing there is we're setting the credentials, the username and the password. Then we're adding an extension, so whatever hardware you want to use with your app, and this will depend on what hardware the merchant wants to use. So there's some discussion that needs to go on here. But just to show you how you set that up, we are extending for a Spire terminal and a DATEX printer. And that's how you initialize the SDK. Once you do that, it's pretty much ready to go and talking to the public test environment in the back end. So if I do a quick run and use the Nexus 5X simulator, we can take a look at our application. Okay, so here is the application in Android. We really made it similar to the Xcode user interface, so there's commonality among the two apps. If you happen to be an Android and an Xcode developer, that's very useful. So we've got a keypad here and cash and card buttons. If we go out, we also have the menu, but we're really focusing on payments. So if I want to just go in and do a quick test, I do a €100 cash transaction and push the cash button, and it's successful. So the reason for this is because we're initializing, we've talked to the back end processes this transaction and sends us all the information that we need. So we just put through a cash transaction on our Android app. Let's go in and briefly look at the user interface. So if we look at activity main, that's the main menu that we saw, but the actual work of the payment is done with the fragment payment XML file. So you can see this is the design of the main screen where we do our transactions. We've got the card button and the numeric digits here. Anyway, not going to cover how to set up user interface. We really want to focus on the Java and hooking into the SDK code. So let's jump up here to the payment fragment Java file, because this is doing a lot of the work for us. Before doing that though, let me go over to the integrate sales manager, because we're still in the sales manager. We're looking at sales request cache, because the model and the code is a little bit different on the Java side. So let's just go down and look at the Android design. So you've got a sales item that gets passed around, or a sale item, and you've got a sale item type, very similar to Swift. And then you need to set a sale item, again, very similar, and then you need to add a cash payment to that. So if we go down, click on the Android icon, here's the actual code. The same general concept. You set an amount, you set a currency, and then you add the cash payment. You'll recognize the design. It's very similar to Xcode. And again, I've covered this before, but as a developer, if you want to grab this code, just go into the raw view and do a copy paste. I've already got it in my application in the payment fragment. So I'll skip over some of that code up top and jump down to the do payment method, because this is really where the cash transaction gets processed. So if we take a look through here, this is all just set up, but here's the sale builder. So Android Java uses a lot of builder mechanisms to set up the objects, but fundamentally we're setting the amount, we're setting the currency, and we're telling it whether to include tax. Now at this point, the code branches off. If we want to do a cash transaction, we do this. Otherwise, we're looking at a card transaction and we do this. And what we then do is build the sale builder object with the sale item. So the items are the actual things that somebody buys. We didn't put an item, but we bought something for 100 euros because we're just using dummy data. So you can see the name of that item was just demo item. It's a purchase. And we pass in the amount value that the user entered, and then we actually run the ePOS SDK sales. Now this is really critical right here. Let me jump back and just show you that, remember, there are 9 different components to the architecture. We showed them here, but the main component that you'll use all the time as a developer is Sales Manager. So to invoke the Sales Manager, you basically just say ePOS object, ePOS SDK object, and then sales, and that invokes all the functionality of the Sales Manager component. So then what we're going to do is run the pay method on Sale Builder, and we're doing a lot of subscribing to events. There's actually a whole chapter in the documentation about that. Java developers will know all about that, so I won't cover that in detail. But fundamentally, what we're getting back, or what we're listening for, is either a sale event, which means our sale went through, or a throwable event. And if we get our sale event, we're going to then put the receipt into the user interface. And that's it. So really just maybe 10, 15 lines of code, everything you need to process a cash transaction. Let's go back to the documentation and just do a quick review, because again, a lot of details. So if I go back to the SDK architecture, remember there's 9 different components that make up the architecture. We've really been focusing on the Sales Manager because that's where you handle the cash and the card transactions. But now we're going to look at the Terminal Manager. Remember, all of these 3, 4 here are all related to hardware, and the Terminal Manager handles the discovery of a card reader or terminal device, because obviously if you want to do card transactions, you need a terminal hooked up to your app. Now I can't actually do it here, but I can show you in our simulator. If we go over and look at the settings, you can see down the bottom we've got cash register, printer, but up top we have a terminal. So essentially you connect your card reader terminal and it'll show up in the list that you see here in the app. And that's really all you have to do. You do have to add a little bit of code, so let me show you that now. If we go under the Sales Manager documentation under card, scroll down just a little bit, here's the Android object model. So once again, the sale request object with the type of purchase is doing the bulk of the work in the code, and we've got an add card payment, but we just pass it the terminal. So if you've got a terminal connected, you pass that into the transaction, and then it gets a little more complicated than that. Obviously, there's all these terminal events that you need to deal with. And again, we have code stubs, so signature request, signature confirmation, app signature confirmation event, payment info event, all of these various events that the terminal will send back, you need to deal with. But we provide all the code for you to do that down here. We click on the Android icon and all the Java code you need is all right here. So just quickly to show you Terminal Manager, to discover the terminal, here's what the code looks like. So skip over to Android, and you can see, remember, ePOS is our main object, ePOS SDK in the app that we're looking at. But basically, you run the terminal, this invokes the terminal component, and then you run the Discover Devices method, and that method grabs any terminals that are connected. And that's really all you need. That's how you do a card and a cash transaction with the Android version of the app. That just about wraps it up. As you can see on my screen here, we've got a nice little Android app that processes cash and card transactions, and a very similar app over on the iPhone iOS side that does cash and card transactions as well. So that's just maybe 5% of what the SDK can do for you, but it's really your starting point. It hints at some of the more powerful features. So just to wrap up, I'll show you some of those other powerful features that are offered by the SDK. If we go in the Integrate section, Sales Manager, we touched on cash and card, but beyond that, we've got our alternative payment methods like WeChat and Alipay. We've got sales returns, reversals, history, receipts. All the code you need, as always, is here. We have Objective-C and Swift code, so you can grab whatever code you need. We also have the Android code as well. Next, we have Cash Manager, so everything you need to run a cash operation in your store or restaurant. So starting the shifts, ending shifts, pay in, pay out, cashiers, it's all in there. Shift reports, you can easily generate Z reports as well. Terminal Manager we covered, that's a little bit more to do with hardware. So let's look at the catalogs. There's a really powerful feature, we call it the Inventory Manager, that you can connect to your backend and see the inventory levels, the prices, the photos of your products, and actually display them in the app, which is great for staff in a store. They can walk around and have all the prices and the inventory levels available right there on their mobile device. So again, you can look up this site, it's public, and it has all the information. The rest is mostly hardware. You can hook up a scanner, you can hook up a printer manager or a cash drawer. And finally, we have Customer Manager. If you've got 100,000 customers stored in your database, you can bring in all of that information. If you offer discount cards to your customers, you can use our terminal to swipe that card and offer special discounts for your special customers. And then finally, we have User Manager. And if you've got 10, 20, 30, 100 staff in a location, you're going to need them to be sharing a couple of mobile devices. So the User Manager allows you to set up for multiple users, passwords, authentication, and so forth. So it's really everything you need to run your payment operations with this SDK. All the code, all the functionality you need is right here. And yeah, I think that's about it. I hope I've shown you a lot of the SDK, and I hope you're as excited about it as I am. And if you want more information, you can go to the Wirecard site or the Wirecard ePOS GitHub repositories and take a look at the code, and you can get developing. And really, I mean, the essence, the final thing I wanted to say is, you know, you could create this app by yourself, but you're looking at a few months or a year at least, because there's hundreds of thousands of lines of code, objects, inheritance. You know, with this SDK, the fundamental value is that you can create an app, maybe not in 25 minutes like we did it here today, but you can create a brand new app in a few days. And that's really the power of the SDK. So I hope you enjoy using it. I hope you enjoy developing on it. And thanks for listening today.